She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch when a grown woman slapped her across the face in front of a stunned cabin. 12-year-old Emily Morgan just stood there, quiet, steady, holding a white box close to her chest. Most thought she was just a kid sitting in the wrong seat. But within 12 minutes, the plane's atmosphere would shift. Doors would open mid-flight, executives would storm in, and the very people who humiliated her would kneel in front of her, trembling. Why? Because Emily wasn't just a child. She was carrying something powerful, something that could bring an entire system down. The moment Emily Grace Morgan stepped into the business class cabin, a ripple of silent disapproval spread like turbulence. She was 12, barely 5 feet tall, clad in a beige hoodie, jeans, and scuffed sneakers. Her wavy brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail, and in her arms, she clutched a smooth, white box wrapped in a seatbelt extender like it was priceless. To her, it was. The man in 1C lowered his newspaper just enough to glance over his glasses. A woman in 2A, dressed in a navy pantsuit, leaned sideways to get a better look. Whispered assumptions floated in the air. Is she lost? Must be a last-minute upgrade. Or, where are her parents? Emily moved with purpose. She didn't slouch or glance around nervously like a kid who had wandered where she didn't belong. She stopped at seat 1A, placed the box carefully down, and sat upright. Her posture was perfect. Too perfect. Like she had been raised to understand that how one carries themselves is sometimes the only armor they'll have. The flight attendant, Jessica, spotted her as she walked down the aisle for pre-departure checks. Her steps slowed as she saw the small figure buckling herself in. Jessica forced a smile. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, crouching beside Emily's seat. "This is business class. Are you sure you're in the right section?" Emily blinked once. Then, without saying a word, she reached into the front pocket of her backpack and handed over her boarding pass. Jessica glanced at it, expecting to find an error. Instead, her eyes registered the words, Emily Morgan, Seat 1A, Priority Passenger. For a split second she froze. Then her eyebrows lifted and she smiled again, more tightly this time. "Well, everything seems fine," Jessica said, but the way she lingered on the word seems left a stain. She returned the boarding pass and stood, turning to speak with another attendant behind her in hushed tones. Emily said nothing. She adjusted the white box on her lap and stared out the window. The engines began to hum beneath them as the plane taxied down the runway. Minutes later, after takeoff, the murmuring started again. A man in the row behind coughed pointedly. The woman in 2A leaned toward the aisle. Her voice, though quiet, carried enough for those nearby to hear. "I don't feel comfortable with unaccompanied children up here," she said to Jessica during drink service. "It's a premium cabin. I mean, are we letting kids into first now?" Jessica hesitated. Then she leaned down and nodded slightly. "We're looking into it." The fasten seatbelt sign pinged off. Jessica walked back toward Emily. "Miss Morgan," she said, more formal now, "would you mind moving to another seat in the rear business cabin? It's just more suitable for our seating balance, and it might make other passengers feel more at ease." Emily looked up at her. She didn't frown, didn't protest. She simply stared for 2 seconds, long enough to unsettle the attendant, then nodded and began to gather her things. She stood with the white box hugged against her chest, turned into the aisle, and began walking toward the rear. Her sneakers made almost no sound on the carpet. The hush in the cabin thickened. She had taken only 3 steps when her elbow lightly brushed against the arm of the woman in 2A, Linda. The woman jerked away as if Emily had burned her. "You touched me," Linda snapped. "Do you think that's okay? Do you have any manners at all?" Emily turned, calm as ever, lips pressed together, and slightly dipped her head in an unspoken apology. But Linda wasn't finished. "You people never learn," she hissed. Then, with one swift motion, she raised her hand and slapped Emily across the cheek. A clean, sharp crack echoed across the cabin. The reaction was instantaneous. Cutlery clattered. A wine glass tipped. A man 3 rows down swore under his breath. But no one moved. No one intervened. Emily stood still. Her head had turned with the slap. A red mark bloomed across her fair skin, but she didn't raise her hand to touch it. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She just slowly turned her head back toward Linda, looked her in the eye, and held that gaze. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't a child's tantrum. It was something else. A look too deep, too composed, too ancient for a girl her age, and that was what unraveled Linda. The woman stammered something, turned away in her seat, and tugged her cardigan tighter around her body, as though trying to shield herself from something invisible. Jessica returned, rushing now. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice a little higher. Emily said nothing. She looked at Jessica, then calmly resumed walking to the back section of business class, where she settled into a seat by the window. She placed the white box back onto her lap, rested her palms gently atop it, and looked out the window again. Her right cheek was still red, but her eyes were distant, unfazed. The cabin around her was silent, uncomfortably so. No one spoke. Even the hum of the engine seemed muted. The silence wasn't peace. It was tension. It was shame. And no one knew yet that the silence had only just begun. Emily sat silently, tucked into the window seat in the rear business cabin. Her posture was unchanged, unshaken by what had just occurred. The soft red imprint on her cheek had begun to fade, but the memory of that slap hung heavy in the pressurized air around her. Her fingers gently caressed the smooth corners of the white box resting on her lap, a box far too delicate to be ordinary, far too heavy to be dismissed. No one knew what was inside. To the flight attendants, it was just an oddly formal carry-on. To the curious passengers, maybe a gift or something ceremonial. But to Emily, it was everything. The final remains of her grandfather, Edward A. Morgan, resided inside. A man revered in history books, but more importantly, the man who taught her the quiet art of standing tall without raising her voice. The box also contained something else. Folded with meticulous care and sealed in an ivory envelope was a letter, marked with the seal of the United States Supreme Court, not addressed to anyone by name. Just one word, printed in bold, neat handwriting across the front. Deliver. Emily's eyes were locked on the glass, watching clouds drift across the setting sun. The orange hue stretched across the wing, but her reflection in the window was still and pale, like porcelain. "Excuse me," a voice broke the silence. It was soft, hesitant. A young flight attendant, no older than her early 20s, stood in the aisle. Her name tag read Sarah. She had a tray in hand but wasn't offering anything. Instead, her eyes were glued to the box in Emily's lap. Is that real cedar wood?" she asked gently, pointing toward the container. Her voice carried the faint accent of the Midwest. Emily didn't speak at first. She looked up slowly, studying the girl's face. Something about Sarah seemed less performative than the others, less trained. "Yes," Emily answered quietly. Sarah nodded, still staring at the engraved brass plate on top of the box. Her lips parted slightly as she leaned in to read the tiny inscription etched beneath the lock. Her expression shifted instantly. The blood drained from her face, and her posture stiffened. The engraving was subtle, almost missed in the ambient light. Edward A. Morgan, 1935-2024, Justice in Silence. Sarah took a small step back, her voice nearly a whisper now. "Is that the Edward Morgan?" Emily didn't answer. She simply placed both hands flat on top of the box, as if shielding it from further attention. Sarah swallowed. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize. He was one of the justices who overturned—" She stopped herself. "I read about him in school. My professor called him the quiet hammer of justice." Emily gave the faintest nod. Her eyes returned to the window. Sarah didn't press. She just stood there a moment, unsure of whether to bow, apologize, or simply vanish. She chose the latter. retreating down the aisle in a daze. From her vantage point, Emily could feel it happening, not in the dramatic way movies portray, but in that slow, creeping ripple that spreads when truth begins to emerge in a place of judgment. The people who once questioned her presence now shifted in their seats. Their gazes flicked toward her, then away, like she had become a mirror too harsh to stare into. Emily reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out a phone, not sleek or new, just a small device wrapped in a soft, hand-stitched cover, decorated with a single embroidered letter, M. She unlocked it without hesitation and scrolled through the short list of contacts. No names, just 3 numbers. One labeled Uncle J. She tapped it. No ringtone. The device was on silent. The screen pulsed as the call connected. A male voice answered immediately. "Yes, it's me," Emily said. Her voice was low but clear. There was a pause. Then, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, glancing at the people seated ahead of her. "But he wouldn't have wanted this." The voice on the other end was silent for a beat. "I understand," he said finally. "Do you need extraction?" Emily shook her head, even though he couldn't see it. "No, I'll complete the flight. Just make sure they know." "They already do," came the quiet reply. "And they're on the way." Emily didn't respond. She ended the call, locked the phone, and placed it back in her hoodie pocket. She adjusted the box on her lap once more, hands smoothing over its polished surface. From several rows ahead, Sarah peeked her head around the galley partition. Her eyes were full of questions, but she said nothing. Her gaze dipped again to the brass plate, and this time, she bowed her head slightly before stepping back out of view. Emily's breathing slowed. Her right hand curled gently over the engraved words, her thumb brushing the first letter of his name. Justice in silence. It was never meant to be just a motto. It was the creed he lived by. And now, the message he entrusted her to carry. Not to the court, not to the media, but to the conscience of the system he had once helped to build. Emily's eyes returned to the window. The sun was lower now, half submerged behind a bank of clouds. Golden light streamed through the glass, casting a soft glow on her cheek, the same cheek that had been struck. She tilted her head slightly, letting the warmth sink in. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the uncomfortable hush of guilt or ignorance. It was the beginning of reverence. Emily's fingers hovered over the phone once more, this time not out of hesitation, but calculation. The silence in the cabin had grown thicker, heavier even. The passengers around her still cast occasional glances, each one more uncertain than the last. But Emily wasn't thinking about them. She wasn't even thinking about Linda or the red bloom that had once stained her cheek. She was thinking about what her grandfather had told her the night before he died. If something goes wrong, use the protocol, but only if you're sure it's not just disrespect, but danger. Emily tapped into the secure app buried behind a layer of innocuous icons. It wasn't listed in the settings, couldn't be accessed without a string of physical gestures and a passcode. When the interface finally opened, it asked for only one thing. Protocol ID? Emily typed, Priority Protocol, Morgan Heaven. No delay, no buffer. The phone immediately dialed a number, no name, no contact photo. The screen displayed only a pulsing gray circle and the words, Connecting via encrypted line. The call was answered after one ring. A man's voice spoke, calm and clipped. This is Langley. Emily's voice was quieter than usual, but it had an edge this time. This is Morgan. A moment of silence. Then, what's the protocol? Morgan 7. Priority elevated. Possible breach. The line changed. Not the volume, not the voice, but the weight behind it. She had just said the equivalent of shouting fire inside the intelligence community. Location? The voice asked. American Airlines Flight 1197. En route from LAX to DCA. Currently cruising. I was removed from my assigned seat. Unlawful contact initiated by passenger and cabin crew. There was a pause. Do they know who you are? Not yet, but one of them saw the name on the urn. Another might suspect. Do you feel threatened? I felt dismissed. I felt like they wanted me gone. That's enough, isn't it? Considering what you're carrying, more than enough. Emily didn't flinch. What's the response? Agents are already converging on your landing zone. One is en route to intercept. You're not to move from your current seat unless absolutely necessary. Do not engage. Do not alert. I know, she said softly. A beat passed. Then the voice softened. Your grandfather trusted very few people. The fact that you're calling means you understand what's at stake. I do, Emily replied. They thought I was just a kid. They always do, the voice murmured. The call ended with no goodbye, no static. Just a cold return to the home screen. Emily held the phone in her lap for a moment longer before powering it down. She tucked it deep into the inner lining of her backpack, zipped it closed, and placed the bag beneath her feet. Across the aisle, a businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The woman beside him pulled her scarf tighter. No one dared speak. A few rows ahead, Sarah, still pale from her earlier realization, spoke in hushed tones to a senior flight attendant. Neither of them noticed the security camera in the upper bulkhead slowly adjusting its angle to face their discussion. Emily reached for the urn once more, her fingers tracing the edge of the brass plate. Her thoughts drifted not to the slap, not to the humiliation, but to the document sealed within the urn's base. She hadn't read it. She'd been instructed not to. Her grandfather's instructions were explicit. Deliver it, intact, unopened, to the individual awaiting her at the DC terminal. But she knew what it contained. She had overheard just enough during those final weeks in the hospital. Enough to understand that this wasn't just about legacy. It was leverage. Her grandfather had uncovered a corruption network that stretched into multiple federal agencies, including the FAA and the executive board of the very airline she was flying on. The document contained enough classified testimony, financial records, and whistleblower statements to ignite a congressional firestorm. And someone on board might have known that. It wouldn't take much. A single cabin crew member with a tip-off, a name mentioned during a background check. Someone who realized the child in 1A was more than just a child. And then came the suggestion to move her. The sudden slap. An excuse to isolate her, to separate her from her assigned seat, her registered location in the manifest, her priority-tagged box. That's what made this more than a misunderstanding. It made it a possible breach of national security. Emily looked toward the front of the cabin where Jessica had reappeared, lips taut, eyes darting toward her every few seconds. Behind her, Linda sat stone-faced, arms crossed, still simmering in her own misplaced righteousness. Emily turned her gaze back to the window. She could see the soft curve of the earth below now, painted in twilight hues. Somewhere far beneath, cars moved like flickering insects across highways, oblivious to the storm brewing 30,000 feet above. The intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of the pilot. "We'll be making a brief altitude adjustment due to a minor systems check. Nothing to be concerned about." But Emily knew better. That wasn't a systems check. That was an altitude shift to prepare for a possible mid-air personnel transfer. The kind of maneuver used in only the most sensitive situations. They were coming. For her. Or rather, for what she carried. She adjusted her seatbelt, keeping one hand on the urn. The other rested calmly in her lap, steady as stone. The girl who was once considered out of place had just activated a protocol that could rattle an entire network of influence and power. And the next few hours would reveal who else knew the truth, and who might try to silence it before the plane touched the ground. It began with a subtle shift, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to someone like Emily. The engines rumbled slightly louder than before, their tone no longer as even. The seatbelt sign chimed back on, though there was no turbulence in sight. A faint buzz of radio chatter spilled from the cockpit door as it opened briefly to admit a uniformed flight officer, who whispered something into the pilot's ear and then slipped back out like a ghost. Emily's eyes never left the window, but she listened to everything. The cabin had transformed. The calm, curated ambiance of business class was gone, replaced by a thick undercurrent of nervous movement. Flight attendants moved with forced composure. Trays were cleared faster. Carts rolled with unnecessary speed, and smiles tightened like drawn bows. She felt it before she saw it. The storm was coming closer. Jessica, the cabin chief, reappeared, standing at the front of the cabin. Her eyes scanned the rows like a general surveying the field before battle. When she thought no one was watching, her gaze locked on Emily and stayed there longer than necessary. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was calculation. Jessica leaned toward another attendant, whispered something sharp and short, then turned and pretended to check a storage compartment. But her eyes kept flicking back. Emily sat still, unmoved. Her left hand rested on the urn. Her right, under the blanket, tapped slow, silent rhythms on her thigh. 8 beats, then pause, then repeat. A coded pulse, learned from the man whose ashes now lay inside the box. Then, a shadow fell across her tray table. A man sat beside her. She hadn't noticed him bored. She was certain the seat next to hers had been empty when the plane took off. But now he was here, dressed like any other passenger. Gray sport coat, black jeans, reading glasses. A tablet rested on his lap, screen dark. He didn't speak at first, just nodded politely and pulled out a book titled Corporate Ethics in Aviation. His hands were large but careful, the kind of hands used to holding more than literature. His eyes, behind those glasses, scanned the room once every 20 seconds with mechanical precision. Emily didn't turn toward him, but she spoke. "You're late." The man smiled faintly, not looking at her. Traffic above Kansas was heavier than expected. "Langley sent you?" He turned a page. "No, Cabinet did. Langley only has partial jurisdiction over this situation now." Emily exhaled quietly, her eyes still fixed on the middle distance. "Does Jessica know?" The man didn't nod. He didn't blink. But Emily caught the twitch of his left pinky, a subtle affirmative. His finger tapped once against the tablet screen and then stilled. "She's trying to isolate you," he said. "Nothing official yet. But there's chatter." Emily nodded slowly. "They saw the name, and someone likely reported it up the chain. We believe someone from the executive team flagged you the moment your boarding pass triggered the Morgan ID in the manifest." She sat up straighter. "So this wasn't just a cabin reaction. It was premeditated." "Possibly," the man admitted. "Or maybe opportunistic prejudice that happened to align with a larger interest." She thought for a moment. "So they thought if they could move me, they could claim I was a standby upgrade?" The man finally looked at her, and this time, his eyes held the gravity of hard truths. "They thought they could erase your presence from the priority list. And if something were to happen to that box..." His voice faded, but the implication lingered like smoke. Emily tightened her grip on the urn. "They don't know what's inside." "Let's keep it that way." Intercom pinged again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to remain seated as we coordinate with air traffic control on an updated flight path. We thank you for your patience." The words were calm, but the repetition of communication was not standard. Emily knew that much. Something was being coordinated, likely an airborne personnel intercept, possibly a shadow reroute. Whatever it was, it involved her. Jessica walked down the aisle again, this time slower, her eyes scanning like radar. She stopped beside Emily's row and smiled that same smile from earlier, tight-lipped, too polite. "Hi again," she said. "Everything all right?" Emily looked up at her without answering. The man beside her spoke instead. "Everything's fine," he said. "My niece and I are enjoying the flight." Jessica blinked, just briefly. She looked between them, her facade cracking ever so slightly. "Oh, I didn't realize you were traveling together," she said smoothly. "We like to keep it low-key," he replied, flipping another page in his book. Jessica hesitated, then nodded. "Well, let me know if you need anything." Her eyes lingered on the urn. Then she walked away. Emily turned to the man. "You're not actually my uncle?" He smirked. "No, but I'd die like one if I had to." She believed him. The cabin buzzed again. This time it wasn't the intercom. It was a ripple, a strange coordination of crew members walking quickly, opening compartments that had already been checked, whispering to each other with earpieces jammed into their collars. Emily felt it building. The moment before impact. The tipping point. "ETA?" she asked. 17 minutes, the man replied. "Then the real fun begins." She nodded. And then, for the first time since she'd boarded, Emily allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy. It was the calm that comes when you know the next move is yours, and theirs is checkmate. The altitude change was subtle, but Emily noticed it instantly. Her inner ear caught the shift before the pilot ever spoke. The plane dipped just slightly, too gently for turbulence, too controlled for rerouting. The hum of the engines lowered in pitch. Even the cabin pressure felt altered, like the air had thickened with anticipation. Passengers stirred. Some looked out the windows, puzzled. Others adjusted their seatbelts instinctively. The intercom didn't chime this time, and that silence was its own kind of alarm. Emily leaned forward slightly, watching the aisle and the front galley like a chessboard about to be flipped. She kept her hands on the urn, her knuckles resting lightly on its cool surface. The man beside her, her silent protector, closed his book and set it face down on the tray table. He didn't speak, didn't look at her, but his body had shifted subtly, spine straighter, feet planted, fingers loose and ready. That's when she heard it, a hiss of pressurization. The quiet, almost imperceptible seal of the forward cabin door being overridden. Emily's eyes narrowed. That door wasn't supposed to open mid-flight. Not at cruising altitude. Not unless there was a mechanical failure or a coordinated air operation. And this flight had not declared an emergency. Except, maybe it had. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, just for a flicker, and then stabilized. A low chime sounded, not from the intercom, but from the control panel near the cockpit. Then, the front curtain of the first-class section snapped open. A man stepped through. He didn't belong on this flight. That much was clear from the moment he appeared. His charcoal gray suit wasn't commercial, too crisp, tailored with military precision. His white shirt was spotless, his tie a deep navy blue with a single pin, a small silver eagle perched on a shield. He carried no briefcase, no bag, just a leather folder tucked under his arm and a presence that seemed to suck the noise out of the room. Jessica, the flight chief, approached him immediately, flustered. "Sir, you can't be in here. How did you even—" He handed her a badge. Not a regular TSA clearance, not FAA credentials. Presidential. Her voice caught in her throat. She stepped back. I didn't realize." "You don't need to," he said calmly, "but you will comply." Passengers began whispering furiously now. Phones were lifted, some subtly recording, others just trembling in hands. The man in gray walked past them all, ignoring the murmurs, eyes locked ahead. He reached Emily's row, stopped, and gave her a small, respectful nod. "Miss Morgan." Emily looked up, calm as ever. "Sir." He extended his hand, not for a shake, just an open palm, an invitation. Emily didn't move at first. She studied him, reading his posture, his breath, the way he angled his shoulder to block the view of a nearby camera. Then, with deliberate grace, she reached into her hoodie and pulled out the envelope. It was thick, bound with wax seal, labeled with only one word: deliver. She placed it in his hand without ceremony. The man took it, slid it into the folder under his arm, and nodded once more. Then he turned to the rest of the cabin. "I am Special Envoy Nicholas Hart, dispatched under Executive Order 3A. This flight is now under temporary federal jurisdiction for the duration of classified material transfer." Jessica's face went pale. Hart turned back to Emily. "Thank you for your service, Miss Morgan. Your grandfather would be extraordinarily proud." Emily nodded slightly. "He believed in quiet hands, strong ones." Hart smiled faintly. "As do I." Then he turned and walked back up the aisle. The front curtain closed behind him. The hum of the engines resumed their usual pitch, and slowly, the plane began climbing back to its cruising altitude. It was over in 3 minutes. But for the people in that cabin, the silence afterward was deafening. Jessica staggered back to the galley, visibly shaken. One of her attendants tried to ask a question, but she raised her hand to silence them. Emily sat back in her seat, the urn still in her lap. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't smirk. Her face was unreadable. Beside her, the man who had claimed to be her uncle smiled now, just a little. "You didn't even blink," he said quietly. "I didn't need to," she replied. "Do you know what was in that envelope?" Emily turned her head slightly, her gaze distant. Evidence, witness statements, testimonies, financial trails, all tying together corruption between aviation regulators, airline execs, and private lobbying groups, and a list of names. He whistled softly. "Big enough to bring down a few careers." "Big enough to bring down a system," Emily corrected. The man nodded slowly. "They sent a presidential envoy for it." "No," Emily said, her voice firmer now. "They sent him to make sure no one buried it again." A pause. "Because last time, they tried." The man stiffened slightly. "You mean, my grandfather was threatened 3 weeks before he died," she said. "He didn't tell anyone except me. Said if anything happened, I was the backup." The man looked at her now, really looked. 12 years old, and you're walking a line most adults wouldn't dare." "I'm not walking it," she said. "I'm guarding it." And with that, she leaned her head back against the seat, closed her eyes, and breathed in the recycled air of the cabin. The plane was still flying east, toward DC, but the real flight had just begun. The cabin hadn't yet recovered from the sight of a presidential envoy boarding mid-flight when the second wave of shock arrived. The intercom chimed again, but this time, it wasn't the familiar voice of the pilot or a flight attendant. This voice was male, firm, and unmistakably external. "This is Commander Davis of the Federal Aviation Administration, in coordination with Homeland Security and the Office of Executive Affairs. All cabin crew are to immediately pause operations and report to the forward galley." There was a beat of silence, then movement. Flight attendants froze mid-task. Trays were left abandoned. Beverage carts rolled unattended into corners. Jessica's face, already pale from the earlier visit of Envoy Hart, drained of all remaining color. Passengers whispered fiercely now, craning their necks, phones filming shakily as crew members hesitantly made their way toward the front of the aircraft. Jessica reached for the intercom handset, but before she could speak, a second voice came through. Sharper, colder. "Do not touch the communication panel again. Final warning." She dropped the handset like it had burned her. Emily watched all of this from her seat in the rear business cabin, expressionless. Her hand rested on the urn in her lap, her fingers calm, as if steadying not the container, but the entire room. The man beside her, still reading corporate ethics in aviation, closed the book at last and spoke softly. "Any second now." As if on cue, the curtain separating business class from first was swept open again. Envoy Nicholas Hart stepped through, flanked by 2 air marshals in dark suits with lapel pins shaped like eagles clutching lightning bolts. He didn't speak until he reached the center of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hart said clearly, his voice carrying without force, "this aircraft has been temporarily placed under executive jurisdiction due to an ongoing investigation into aviation misconduct." A collective gasp swept through the rows. One of the marshals stepped forward and pulled out a sleek tablet, tapping quickly. "In accordance with FAA Directive 44C, Section 17, he read, "we are invoking immediate accountability protocol. This allows for public acknowledgement of critical violations while in transit." Jessica raised a trembling hand. "Sir, we didn't. This is all a misunderstanding," the girl. "The girl," Hart said, turning slowly toward her, "is Emily Grace Morgan, legal custodian of federal evidence under presidential seal. The seat she occupied was not only purchased legitimately, but designated under the Morgan Clause as priority secure transport. You removed her. You endangered the evidence. You allowed physical assault by a civilian passenger under your supervision." Jessica stumbled back, lips moving but no sound emerging. Hart's expression didn't change. "You will kneel," he said, as simply as if asking her to hand over a pen. "What?" she choked. "You will kneel," he repeated, louder this time, "as a formal act of acknowledgement, on record, to the child you publicly humiliated, discredited, and endangered." Jessica looked around wildly. Her colleagues stared at her, frozen in place. One of them, a tall blonde man, swallowed hard, stepped forward, and lowered himself to his knees without a word. Another followed, then a third. One by one, the flight attendants of Flight 197 knelt in the narrow aisle, their heads bowed, their trembling hand resting on their thighs. Jessica remained standing. "I didn't mean harm," she said. "It was just a protocol issue. I didn't know who she was." Hart nodded. "And when you didn't know, you assumed she was nothing." Then he turned to Linda. The woman was seated, arms crossed, lips drawn into a bitter line. But even she couldn't maintain composure as one of the air marshals stepped beside her. "You assaulted a federal courier," he said. "That's absurd," Linda snapped. "She bumped me. She was rude. I was defending myself. You struck a priority passenger. You did so in a public setting, and you showed no remorse, even after her identity was revealed." The air marshal reached into his coat and pulled out a slim pair of restraints. "You are being detained under Article 8 of the Air Safety Act. You will be escorted upon landing to federal custody." "You're making a mistake," Linda shouted as the marshal fastened the cuffs around her wrists. "She's just a kid. You're all being manipulated." But no one moved to help her. No one protested. She was walked down the aisle. Ironically, the very same aisle she had tried to claim as her own social territory only an hour ago. Emily didn't watch her. Her eyes were fixed ahead, steady as always. Hart turned back to the kneeling crew. "Lift your heads," he commanded. They did, slowly, shamefully. "Look at her," he said. One by one, they turned their eyes to Emily. "This is what justice looks like," Hart said. "Not rage, not punishment, but acknowledgement, humility, the willingness to face what you did, even if it wasn't your intent." Emily blinked slowly. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "I forgive you." The words landed harder than any reprimand. Jessica's face crumpled. Tears welled. She bowed her head again. Then Hart turned to the passengers. "This is not a spectacle," he said. "But this is being recorded, not just by your phones, but by the Office of Public Trust. Transparency begins here, not on the ground, not in press releases, but in real time." Already, social media lit up. Flight 197 began trending. Screens glowed across the cabin as live streams, posts, and texts burst into the digital ether. The world was watching. And for once, the world would not forget. Emily didn't move from her seat. Even as the cabin buzzed with the electric crackle of live streams and stunned murmurs, she remained still, composed, hands resting atop the urn, spine straight, eyes forward. She wasn't watching the world react. She was waiting for it to settle. And when it did, her name rang through it like a bell. A voice, measured, authoritative, came through the overhead system. But it wasn't the pilot, and it wasn't the FAA commander. It was Nicholas Hart. "Passengers of Flight 197, please remain seated and refrain from communication for the next few moments. The following message has been authorized by the Executive Office." A pause, then a second voice, feminine, familiar to anyone who had watched the evening news. "This is White House Chief of Staff Lorna Reyes. In coordination with the Department of Justice and the Federal Aviation Administration, We wish to formally acknowledge the actions of one individual aboard this aircraft. The cabin fell to a hush again. Even phones stopped recording mid-frame. The only sound was the steady whisper of the plane as it cut through clouds. In recognition of her composure, her duty, and her unwavering execution of a federal transfer, we offer the following. Ms. Emily Grace Morgan, on behalf of your grandfather's legacy and the institutions he protected, we are sorry. The sentence settled in the air like a monument. Gasps were audible. A man in row 3 lowered his phone, realizing he was witnessing history, not scandal. A woman behind Emily quietly wiped her eyes with the edge of her scarf, and in the front galley, Jessica, the disgraced chief flight attendant, covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Emily didn't flinch, but the silence she held now felt different. Not the quiet of trauma or strategy, but the stillness of fulfillment. Beside her, the man who had posed as her uncle leaned slightly toward her. You heard that? I did. No 12-year-old in history has ever been addressed on an open airline frequency by the White House. She allowed herself the faintest smile. Not yet. Then she reached for the envelope. It had rested silently in a hidden sleeve beneath the urn. An envelope bound in dark burgundy leather, sealed not with wax this time, but with a biometric strip embedded into the fold. The seal pulsed once under her fingers, then quieted, awaiting a recipient. Nicholas Hart approached again. His presence, even now, carried the same gravity it had when he'd first stepped aboard. But there was a shift. He wasn't here as a dominator or enforcer anymore. He was here as a witness. Emily stood. The cabin collectively held its breath. She turned to face him, stepping slightly into the aisle. Her voice carried, though she didn't raise it. I, Emily Grace Morgan, acting as last custodian of Edward A. Morgan's sealed submission, hereby complete the transfer. She extended the envelope. Hart reached out slowly, accepting it with both hands. The moment their fingers met, the biometric strip blinked green, once, twice, then fell dark. Chain of custody acknowledged, Hart said quietly. He turned to go, but Emily spoke again. You should open it here. Hart turned back. Pardon? You should open it here, not on the ground, not in a closed office. Here, now, in front of the people who thought I didn't belong in this seat. Hart hesitated, then nodded. He opened the envelope with practiced hands, revealing a folder thick with documents. Some typed, some handwritten. Embedded within it, a hard drive no larger than a coin, clipped to a summary report. He read the first page, then the second. By the third, his brow furrowed. By the fifth, his jaw tensed. Emily didn't need to ask what he saw. She already knew. Her grandfather had whispered enough on that final night to prepare her. The file contained a full audit trail linking executives from the airline, this airline, to embezzled federal grants, falsified maintenance records, and suppressed whistleblower testimonies. But worse, it named names inside the FAA, senior officials who had received consulting fees in exchange for ignoring safety violations, modifying regulations, and erasing fines from federal records. It wasn't just corruption, it was institutional rot. Hart closed the file slowly. His face was grim. I need to transmit this, he said. You will, Emily replied. But they already have a copy. He blinked. Who? The press. And right on cue, phones lit up across the cabin. Notifications burst onto screens. CNN, BBC, Reuters. Breaking news headlines flooded the airwaves. Whistleblower document linked to Supreme Court justice unveiled mid-flight. Justice Morgan's granddaughter hands over evidence of FAA collusion. Flight 1197. From scandal to national reckoning. Hart looked back at Emily, a strange mix of respect and shock flickering behind his eyes. You planned this, he said. No, she answered. He did. In that moment, Emily wasn't just a child, or a courier, or a symbol. She was the executor of a final move in a game her grandfather had played for decades, against power, against greed, against the slow erosion of truth. The cabin was utterly silent, until a passenger in row 2 stood up, then another and another. A quiet ripple of people rising, not in panic, not in protest, but in acknowledgement. Emily didn't look at them. She returned to her seat, sat down, and placed the urn back in her lap. This was never about revenge. It was about remembrance. The cabin was suspended in silence, not of absence, but of awe. Even at 35,000 feet, something sacred had just taken place. In the wake of the kneeling flight crew, the arrest of a once confident passenger, and the admission of an irrevocable mistake, the aircraft had become more than a vessel in the sky. It was now a stage of national reckoning. And then, it happened. From the front of the plane, Envoy Nicholas Hart stepped forward once more. He faced the entire business-class cabin, flanked by the 2 federal marshals who had executed their duties with unwavering calm. He didn't need a microphone. His voice carried effortlessly. "Miss Emily Grace Morgan," he said, loud enough for every ear to hear. "On behalf of the Office of the President of the United States, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Aviation Administration, on behalf of every citizen who still believes in the power of integrity, we offer our formal apology." He paused. Not just for today, but for everything they tried to bury. Every eye turned to Emily. She didn't stand. She didn't nod. She simply looked back at him, with a gaze not of defiance, but of quiet command. Hart continued, "On behalf of your grandfather's legacy, we are sorry." A murmur ran through the cabin, like a gust of wind passing over a silent lake. People were moved, not by drama, but by something deeper, a sense that something had cracked open and spilled across the clouds. Emily reached into her hoodie. From its inner lining, she pulled out a second envelope, thinner than the one she had already handed over mid-flight, but marked with the same seal. This one, however, bore an additional label, Part 2, for immediate dispersal. She held it up, and Hart stepped forward to receive it. As his fingers touched the envelope, something shifted in his eyes. There was reverence there, but also realization. Whatever was in this one, it was not meant to wait. He turned back toward the cockpit and gave a subtle nod. A nearby marshal tapped his earpiece. Within seconds, a satellite signal pulsed silently through the aircraft's encrypted channel. Hart opened the envelope right there, carefully breaking the wax and unfolding the documents within. There were only 6 pages, but 6 pages that would detonate a storm across an entire industry. He began reading, his brow furrowed, then tightened. His jaw clenched, and when he finally looked up, the expression he wore was no longer diplomatic. It was surgical. Emily spoke at last. "Those files contain internal FAA communications showing they ignored multiple safety violations from this airline, overrode whistleblower reports, and even incentivized staff to look the other way." Hart nodded grimly. "And this name," she interrupted him, "the CEO. His name is Roger Denton, former FAA Deputy Chair, current CEO of Atlantic Wings." Gasps erupted across the cabin. Someone near the front dropped their phone. Another passenger whispered, "That's the same guy who said airline reform was unnecessary hysteria last year." Hart kept reading. "According to these memos," he said slowly, "Linda, yes, the same Linda from earlier, served on the executive board of Atlantic Wings until 2 months ago. She was removed for misappropriation of passenger data access, but no charges were filed." Emily nodded once. "Because Denton protected her. She was part of the leak containment operation." Hart glanced at her, a mix of admiration and disbelief in his eyes. "And you've known all of this?" "I didn't just know," she said quietly. "I watched my grandfather gather every piece. I helped him scan them, categorize, encrypt. He knew he wouldn't live to deliver it himself, so he trained me." Whispers surged again, this time spreading beyond business class. The marshal tapped his earpiece again. "Sir, we're getting real-time news reports." The files have already hit 3 major outlets. Someone on this plane is streaming to press. Hart didn't react. Let them. And just like that, a ripple turned tidal. Media networks picked up the feed mid-sentence. A 12-year-old girl on Flight 197 has just handed over evidence linking the FAA and a major airline CEO to ongoing corruption and suppression of safety violations. Screens flashed, headlines formed, tweets exploded, and one phrase began repeating across platforms, hashtags, and television crawls like wildfire. The silent whistleblower. Emily said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was power. From her seat, she simply closed her eyes for a moment, letting the storm swirl around her without consuming her. The cabin had transformed once again, not through humiliation or chaos, but through truth. For the first time, passengers weren't avoiding her. They were leaning toward her. One man whispered, "That's Edward Morgan's granddaughter." Another woman clutched her heart and mouthed, "Thank you." Even Jessica, still kneeling a few rows away, stared with wide eyes, no longer at a child, but at the force that child carried. Nicholas Hart folded the envelope and turned toward the cockpit. "Get this to the command channel. Full leak authorization." One of the marshals saluted. "Already in motion, sir." As the aircraft continued toward Washington, D.C., flying high above the eastern states, the girl once mistaken for a misplaced passenger had become a name echoing across a nation. Emily Grace Morgan, the silent whistleblower who said nothing, but revealed everything. The descent was not just physical, it was systemic. As Flight 1197 sliced through the sky toward its destination, the world beneath it trembled. Within hours of the leak, media outlets began reporting not just on the documents themselves, but on the sprawling network of corruption they exposed. The implications were catastrophic. The Federal Aviation Administration, long seen as an untouchable authority, was now bleeding credibility on live television. Internal emails showed years of redacted whistleblower complaints, pilot testimonies ignored, mechanical warnings dismissed to meet quota deadlines. Worst of all, they revealed a pattern, one that stretched back over a decade. And at the center of that pattern stood a name that had once only existed in polished headlines and corporate keynotes: Roger Denton, CEO of Atlantic Wings. The documents Emily had delivered did more than accuse him. They verified his orchestration. There were recorded conversations, signature-verified authorizations, even video footage from a 2017 board meeting in which Denton referred to safety violations as cost of doing business. But what stunned the public most wasn't just the scale, it was the connection. Roger Denton had not just worked for the FAA, he had risen within its ranks. He had overseen policy changes that deregulated regional air checks, streamlined internal investigations, and reduced accountability for commercial carriers. And then, just 3 years later, he took the helm of Atlantic Wings, where those very policies fattened the company's profit margins. Now, the same man was being dragged into federal hearings. Linda, the passenger who slapped Emily, had once been his close associate. Their emails, now public, revealed a chilling tone of casual elitism, mocking employees, dismissing customer complaints, and laughing about how easy it is to buy silence. Her arrest on Flight 1197 had become more than poetic justice. It had become symbolic. The fall from power wasn't gentle. Denton issued a brief statement through his attorney the next morning, flatly denying the accusations and calling the documents a juvenile stunt orchestrated by a grieving family member. But his voice was drowned out, because Emily's had never tried to compete with it. That was the brilliance. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't fought. She had walked onto a plane with ashes in her lap and truth in her pocket, and simply delivered it. The press called her many things, but one name rose to the top, echoed through interviews, news crawls, op-eds, and trending hashtags: the silent whistleblower. Major anchors paused mid-broadcast to clarify, "Yes, she's 12." Analysts wiped away tears as they replayed the footage of her forgiving the kneeling crew. One commentator on a primetime panel whispered, "She carries the kind of gravity you only see in courtroom legends. And she hasn't even started high school." Across America, photos of Emily sitting quietly with the urn went viral, the brass nameplate glinting under the cabin lights, her small fingers resting gently on its surface, her gaze never begging for attention, yet commanding it all the same. The Office of Inspector General launched a formal investigation within 24 hours. Subpoenas were issued. Emergency meetings were called. Denton was placed on indefinite leave, pending criminal charges. Several FAA officials voluntarily resigned within 2 days, their names already trending in disgrace. The president, who had never spoken of Justice Edward Morgan beyond formal eulogies, released a rare public statement. What Emily Grace Morgan has done is not just courageous, it is clarifying. In the silence of a child, we heard the conscience of a nation. Even those who had once whispered in skepticism now held their tongues, because the evidence didn't lie. And neither did Emily. But even amidst the headlines, interviews, and think pieces, she remained quiet. No press conference, no school tour, no brand deals or book contracts. She declined every talk show invitation, every magazine cover. The only quote she allowed through her legal counsel was simple: "I did what my grandfather prepared me to do." She was not building a platform. She was honoring a promise. In the days following the leak, waves of aviation workers stepped forward. Mechanics, flight attendants, even former pilots, many of whom had once been silenced, began to speak. Not in anger, but in solidarity. They cited Emily's name as the reason. And so, quietly, without protest or fire, a new era began. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was irreversible. And at the heart of it was a girl who never shouted. She didn't need to. Her silence had already spoken. The letter was handwritten, not typed, not printed, not encrypted on a hard drive or locked away behind biometric security. It was written with a fountain pen. The ink faded just slightly where the nib had pressed harder in certain words, like he wanted to make sure those thoughts would never disappear, no matter how long they sat in a drawer. It was found beneath the urn, folded into a leather-bound journal tucked inside a hidden compartment of the cedarwood box. The compartment had been discovered only after a quiet knock came to Emily's door at sunrise, one day after the public hearing against Roger Denton had begun. She had known it was there. Her grandfather had hinted as much, but she hadn't opened it. Not until now. The media frenzy hadn't stopped. Her face continued to flood every news outlet. Journalists huddled outside her family's home in Georgetown, hoping for a glimpse, a quote, a tear. But Emily remained inside, in the room her grandfather once used for quiet study. Walls lined with legal texts, worn casebooks, and framed sketches of Supreme Court justices drawn in charcoal. This was his temple of thought, and now it was hers. She opened the letter in silence. Her mother sat nearby, saying nothing, just holding a warm mug of tea with both hands as though it were a ritual of presence. The first line of the letter struck her harder than she expected. "If you're reading this, then I've left you more than my name." Her fingers tightened slightly, but she didn't stop. "I know the world can be loud, Emily. It will mock you. It will test you. It will try to drag you into its noise and reward you for shouting back. Don't. Don't fight noise with more noise. Show them dignity. Show them what it looks like when justice doesn't flinch, doesn't scream, doesn't crumble into anger. Show them that silence, when filled with truth, is louder than thunder." A breath caught in her throat. The line echoed in her ears like a bell tolling across generations. She continued reading. "You were never meant to carry my burden, but you are the only one I trust to carry my values. The documents I gave you, they are not revenge. They are instruction. They are course correction. Do not let them become a weapon. Let them become a mirror. If they bring down the crooked, let it be not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. And when they ask you why you did it, don't answer with sound. Answer with presence. Be still, and let truth speak for you." Tears blurred the final lines, but she read them anyway. "You are not my shadow, Emily. You are my heir. She folded the letter with reverent care, smoothing the creases, and placed it back into the journal. Her hand, though small, moved with the same steadiness that had once turned pages of law with practiced grace. The room was silent, but it wasn't empty. Her mother finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper.
"He wrote that 2 months before the diagnosis."
Emily nodded. She rose from her seat, walked to the tall shelf behind the desk, and pulled down an old file box labeled Civic Legacy. Inside were documents that hadn't been touched in years, mostly lecture notes, ethics presentations, essays on moral jurisprudence. She removed a manila folder labeled Personal Codex. Within it, on the first page, was a quote written in large cursive ink. "Justice isn't loud, it's inevitable." That evening, Emily made a decision. For the first time since the flight, she would speak publicly, not on a network, not through a journalist, but in a live stream broadcast hosted by the Public Ethics Council. No stage, no script, just her, seated at her grandfather's desk, with the urn to her left and the letter beside it. Millions tuned in. The stream began with a single frame. Emily seated, her hands resting gently on the desk. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply looked into the camera and spoke one sentence. "This is the last message my grandfather left for me, but I believe it was meant for all of us." And then she read the letter, word for word. By the time she finished, the stream chat was flooded with silence. No emojis, no reactions. Just viewers listening, processing, reflecting. When she finished, she folded the letter again and said nothing more. She looked into the camera for 3 full seconds, then ended the stream. The clip went viral within minutes. Commentators, influencers, and political analysts replayed the sentence about dignity 1,000 times. Schools added the quote to ethics curriculums. Activists printed it on posters. Legislators quoted it on the House floor. But Emily said no more, because she didn't have to. The letter had done the speaking, and its final echo was clear. Justice lives not in volume, but in virtue. It was the most understated historic signing in recent American memory. No stadium, no sweeping music, no red, white, and blue backdrop flapping behind a podium. Just the president at his desk in the Oval Office, a single pen in hand, and a document placed before him bearing a title bold enough to echo across future generations: The Morgan Code of Passenger Rights. The cameras were rolling, but no words were spoken at first. The president glanced to his right, where a small framed photo of Justice Edward Morgan sat, his judicial robes draped with quiet dignity, and a young Emily perched beside him, no more than 7, her hand tucked in his. With solemn resolve, the president signed. Then, only then, did he speak. "This isn't just a passenger bill of rights," he said, holding up the document. "This is a human charter, because justice doesn't pause at 35,000 feet." Applause rippled gently from the small group of civic leaders, aviation officials, and family representatives standing nearby. Emily was not present. By her request, she had declined the invitation with characteristic grace, sending only a note. "My grandfather taught me that real change doesn't need an audience. It needs permanence." The new legislation, drafted with input from multiple oversight groups and whistleblower testimonies, established a sweeping set of passenger protections. It included mandatory transparency on seating policies, penalty bans for racial or class-based reassignment, and an independent ombudsman system for every commercial airline to handle grievances with external oversight. But its cornerstone was clear and simple: the dignity clause. No passenger shall be treated as lesser than another on the basis of age, appearance, perceived status, or lack of visible authority. Already, industry watchdogs were calling it the most progressive aviation policy since deregulation in the 1970s. But what made it remarkable wasn't just its contents, it was its name. Never before had such a law been titled after a private citizen, let alone a minor. Yet now, across screens and newspapers and legal briefs, It was being referred to universally as the Morgan Code. In tandem with the signing, swift changes followed. Roger Denton, long considered untouchable within both government and private sectors, resigned in disgrace from Atlantic Wings. His resignation letter, delivered through legal channels, attempted to frame his exit as an act of stepping aside for the sake of unity. But no one bought it. The public had already decided, and more importantly, so had the market. Within days of the scandal, Atlantic Wings board was forced into emergency restructuring. Shareholders demanded accountability. Civil suits were filed. Denton's assets were frozen pending a full investigation. Whispers of criminal prosecution turned to shouts. The FAA, under immense bipartisan pressure, initiated a top-down reformation campaign. Inspectors who had been silenced were reinstated. An independent advisory board was created, one that included civilian members and former whistleblowers. Most notably, the acting FAA chair released a statement that read, "We failed. We forgot that trust isn't built in policy. It's built in people." Emily Morgan reminded us of that. And yet, through all the fanfare, media cycles, and op-eds, Emily remained quiet. She issued no statements. She accepted no honors. She spent her days back in her grandfather's study, reading, not for school, but for clarity, studying ethics, leadership, and the quiet revolutions that had shaped human rights over centuries. She knew this was not an ending. It was a threshold. The day after the law passed, a handwritten letter arrived at her door. No return address, no signature, just an envelope sealed with lavender wax and a single flower inside, a white camellia. She opened it and read, "I was wrong about everything. I didn't know your name that day. Now I will never forget it. I hope someday I can look you in the eyes and say this, but for now, I offer my apology and my silence. Thank you for the lesson." The handwriting was unmistakably feminine. The strokes were careful, as if written through shame and effort. And though the name wasn't signed, Emily knew who it was. Linda. And with that letter, her story had shifted once again, from retribution to redemption. For all the documents, evidence, and declarations that Emily had delivered, this note, quiet and unsought, meant something different. It meant she had changed not just systems, but souls. That evening, Emily brewed a small cup of tea in the kitchen, using her grandfather's porcelain set. She placed the white camellia in a vase beside the cup. Then she drank in silence. Not in victory, but in peace. The air was still. Morning mist clung to the grass like breath held too long. Emily stood at the gates of Arlington National Cemetery just before sunrise. The guards knew who she was, but no cameras followed. No reporters waited. It had all been arranged with quiet precision, at her request. She wore a simple black coat over her dress, her hands steady as she cradled the urn. The cedar box that had carried the truth across the sky now carried only ashes, light as memory and heavy as legacy. She walked the path alone. There was no ceremonial escort, no military band playing in the distance, just birds beginning to stir in the trees and the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes. She followed the directions exactly. Section 45, Row 8, Marker 312. A plot reserved not for fame, but for service. Edward Morgan had declined a state funeral. "Bury me as a citizen," he had written, "not as a symbol." And so, here she was, at dawn, fulfilling the final part of her promise. A small mat had been prepared beside the grave, a single stone bench, a kettle, 2 cups. The teaware had belonged to her grandfather's mother, a woman of both Japanese and American heritage who had taught her son the art of stillness long before he ever stepped into a courtroom. Emily placed the urn on the bench and knelt. She didn't light incense. She didn't chant. She simply poured water into the kettle, lit the flame, and waited. As the water began to simmer, she laid out the tea leaves, measured without haste. She moved like someone who had done this hundreds of times before, because she had. At home, It had been their ritual. Tea before talks. Tea before truth. The steam rose like smoke from a burning page. She poured the water, steeped it just right, and served the 2 cups, one for her, one for him. No one spoke, but the silence said everything. She sipped slowly, feeling the warmth travel down her throat and settle in her chest.
I brought you the camellia,
she whispered. From her pocket, she pulled the bloom, white, untouched, still fresh from the vase at home. She placed it gently atop the urn.
She said she was sorry.
A breeze moved through the cemetery then, soft and sudden. Leaves danced across the path behind her, and the faintest sound of bells, distant wind chimes, carried through the trees. She knew what he'd say. Forgive and forget, but not the lesson. Never the lesson. She sat there for almost an hour, the tea cooling in the cups, the sun rising higher behind the marble columns in the distance. The city beyond had already begun its daily hum of activity, but here, in the solemn hush of sacred ground, time bent. She could almost hear his voice, not in memory, but in motion, the cadence of how he taught, the pause between thoughts, the certainty when he looked her in the eyes and told her, "Justice is never about glory, it's about grace." When the moment felt right, she rose. She didn't take the cups. She left them, still half full, one final conversation suspended in time. As she turned to leave, she noticed a small envelope tucked under a bouquet of violets resting near a nearby tree. Not on the grave, not in the open. Subtle, respectful. She picked it up. Inside, a card. "Emily, I saw your stream. I saw your silence. I'll never forget what it felt like to kneel because I was wrong. I hope someday I can stand next to you, not as a passenger, not as a bystander, but as someone better. I'm sorry. L. No signature needed." The handwriting was steadier this time. She smiled faintly, folded the card, and placed it back inside the envelope. Then she tucked it beneath the camellia on the urn and whispered, "That's for you too." By the time she reached the gate again, the sun had broken through the trees, casting gold across the headstones like halos. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The silence behind her was enough. It was nearly a week after the Dawn Memorial when Emily found the final letter. She hadn't been looking for it, not consciously, but the house had taken on a rhythm of quiet ritual since the ceremony, polishing the kettle, replacing the flower by the urn each morning, lighting the soft lamp in her grandfather's study every evening. It was in this stillness that clarity often arrived. The letter was hidden in plain sight, taped beneath the bottom drawer of her grandfather's desk, folded flat, sealed in wax bearing a familiar mark, a tiny symbol of balanced scales beneath the initials E.M. Her breath caught when she touched it. The wax cracked gently, and she unfolded the single page inside. Unlike his other letters, rich with paragraphs, footnotes, and careful logic, this one was shockingly sparse. A single sentence written in a hand that trembled just slightly. "Let your silence speak, child. That is justice." There was no signature, no farewell, just those 9 words, etched like the final stroke on a stone. She read it once, twice. Then, for the first time since the flight, since the kneeling, since the broadcast that changed aviation history, she allowed herself to weep, but not from grief, from arrival, because she understood now, completely. The world had tried to define her with its noise, the headlines, the viral clips, the debates, the idolization. But her grandfather had known better. He had raised her not for fame, but for foundation. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat. Then she stepped outside. The streets of Washington, D.C. had already begun to stir, though the sun was still low, casting soft amber hues across the Lincoln Memorial's reflection in the water. Joggers passed, oblivious. Tourists snapped photos without knowing they were standing near the quiet epicenter of something that had forever altered their rights in the sky. Emily walked among them like a shadow, not invisible, just indistinct. No one recognized her face, and that was exactly as she preferred it. Because she wasn't meant to be seen, she was meant to be felt. In policy, in protocol, in the quiet shift of how passengers were treated, how truth was received, how dignity was restored. The girl who didn't shout, the child who didn't raise her voice, and yet somehow the loudest voice in the room. She paused at the edge of the reflecting pool and looked out at the morning city. The White House stood in the distance, obscured by trees, but its silhouette no longer seemed intimidating. She knew what power looked like now. It looked like a cedar box on her lap, a letter written in love, a nation leaning in, not to be dazzled, but to be reminded. She breathed in the cool air and smiled, not for the cameras, not for the applause, for herself and for him. Behind her, a mother explained to her child, "That's where the president signed the new bill." The child asked, "Why did they name it after someone?" The mother replied, "Because of a girl who stayed quiet when she didn't have to." Emily kept walking. She passed statues, monuments, journalists preparing for yet another live broadcast. They didn't turn, they didn't see her, but they all carried her in some way now. Her silence had already spoken, and it would keep speaking. Every time a passenger was treated with dignity, every time a whistleblower wasn't ignored, every time someone remembered that strength didn't have to be loud. By the time she reached the Capitol steps, the sun had fully risen. She didn't climb them. She just stood at their base for a moment, hands in her pockets, letter folded next to her heart. Then she turned and walked away, and though no one asked her name, everyone knew what she had done.